So my name's Mike Taylor, and I would love to be standing in front of you and describing myself as a failed academic. Sadly, my academic career didn't get that far. I left college and I was powered by a desire to communicate science, to support people communicating outcomes, and to support ideas of how science is used and talked about in the community. So naturally enough, I went to work at Elsevier. And after 20 years there, perhaps you could now describe me as being a failed publisher. However, I went to work there, and I started work at Digital Science earlier this year, where I'm the head of metrics development. Today, though, I'm going to be talking in a more personal capacity, because what I'm interested in discussing is some ideas that I've been having about what I feel is being quite an important threat, or an important set of circumstances that could lead to a threat in terms of understanding how research and researchers are being valued by the wider community, and particularly in the new political and socio-economic background. So, a little bit of a background on data and how important the speed of data is. So, it was over 4 decades ago when Garfield first started calculating journal metrics, and it was an enormously time-consuming process. He had to collect citations, indexes on paper. These had to be converted into card records and processed through mainframe computers. This was a process that, to calculate the first impact factors, Garfield's first journal-level metrics took many months, maybe years to calculate. It was very time-consuming and involved mainframe computations. So a couple of years ago, one of my former colleagues and myself decided to do some experimentations in the effect of what would happen if you changed the journal impact factor calculation over time. We did the first calculation. It took less than an hour, which was copying more or less what Garfield had done. We then set up a number of different experiments, did it over a course of 10 years. We pressed the button, we went to the pub, we came back. It hadn't run because we hadn't pressed the button right, but we ran it again. We went back on Monday, and we'd done something like 10,000 equivalent calculations to Garfield, and it had been done in the course of a few hours, and it had cost us just a few $100s in terms of Amazon cloud processing. So, we have seen in the course of this 4 years, this movement from very slow, painstaking calculations to, the kinds of calculations that can be done so incredibly fast, incredibly cheaply, such massive scale that we can now afford to do experimentations and real-time processing of metrics data at a speed and at an advantage that we've never really seen before. One of the things that has happened over the course of the last 40 years is that we've built up a number of truths about metrics, scholarly metrics, that perhaps we can now see in terms of the changing environment as being some old chestnuts. So, for example, we used to say that there was no citation worth calculating in the first year of a journal's life. This is not true anymore. The process, the pace of citation and indexing citations is happening much faster now. So we see real activity within a few months of processing. We can see changes as well. So if you look at the lifespan, if you look at something like 15 years worth of citations for our journals, you can see that the pace of citation is changing. There is much longer citation periods. It happens much faster. There seems to be an increasingly long tail effect on citations as well. So the whole profile of what citations look like and the pace of change has really accelerated over the last few years. And it's very interesting. I mean, if you look at something like a high-energy physics journal, you can see all the citations an article's ever going to get accruing and going within less than 2 years. Whereas something like an archaeology journal, you're looking at something like 8-9 years for the period of citation to come to a maximum pace. And one of the things about journal metrics is that we have these truths, we have these fixed periods, we have these known facts that we've developed and nurtured over the course of 40 years. And many of those facts simply don't hold true anymore. Hasn't kept pace with the data as we know it. But the thing about the scientometric community and wanting to appraise things over long terms is that stability is a really important asset in terms of these data. Having a metric which is calculated the same way on the same data over 10 years is a really important thing when you want to appraise the change of a subject or a journal. About 6 years ago, Cameron and a few other people started talking about altmetrics. Altmetrics being the collection analysis of data of where research outputs, articles are being shared on social media and scholarly networks. One of the great things that was really exciting about altmetrics is that it was very fast. It was one of the things that we really valued about it, because a paper might be published in a prepress, might be tweeted about, and we would have data within hours of a paper becoming available. And this was an absolute revolution. Given that we come from, the bibliometric community comes from a background where we don't see citations for maybe 18 months, 2 years, getting data within an hour or two is really quite extraordinary. It was an absolute revelation. And many people hoped that this would lead to us being able to predict citation. It turns out, actually, that altmetrics is not a great predictor of citations. Some things, like Mendeley, where you have researchers who are actively curating lists of articles that they want to read or to use, that has a correlation with citation, but it's quite a low correlation. Something like Twitter has almost no correlation worth thinking about at all. What it does correlate with are the subjects that Cameron was just talking about, the things that are interesting. Climate change, some social sciences, some field parts of physics. So there's some really interesting. Nowadays we talk about altmetrics as being a provider of data that gives a broader impact rather than a faster impact of what our scholars are going to do about citation. But the issue here is that even though citation has improved in speed, it's still not fast enough for people who want to make decisions. There is this hunger, this appetite for faster calculations. There's no longer a willingness to wait for 2 years to see whether something is going to be successful or not, or rather whether it has been successful. People are much more interested in prediction and trying to understand what is going to be successful before it's been successful. We saw a couple of weeks ago a company making an announcement about a product where they're hoping to do data mining to show publishers which articles are going to be successful in the future. And this is the kind of thing that I find kind of intellectually interesting, and I find politically rather challenging. But there is the pressure there. People want data earlier. They want to be able to make decisions earlier. If people have the information to make those decisions earlier, they'll be able to profit from them earlier. They'll be able to have a competitive advantage. There is another aspect to the speed of data and the ability to process data at high volumes and very quickly. And that is that we can start thinking about making predictions and making computing metrics which are much more personal than ever before. Now, we haven't really seen this in the scholarly area yet, but nevertheless, I think there is, generally speaking, a move towards being able to facilitate this kind of computation in the future. We certainly know, retailers know, that the more personal the recommendation, the more likely you are to respond to advertising messages about the things that you're involved with. So, for example, if I go online and I search for, say, a Trek 3700 mountain bike, not that that's on my Christmas list, it used to be the case that I would just get an advert for bikes from Google. Nowadays, I get an actual picture of the bicycle model and colour that I was looking at last. And the reason why they do this is because these things are relatively easy to commercialise. There is a direct relationship between them showing me an advert that I am most likely to respond to. And in fact, Google and Amazon, and to some extent Apple and Microsoft, are building an entire infrastructure which is based around capturing this data. So Amazon and Google both have these devices that listen to what you're saying. They both have these enormous cloud infrastructures and intellectual abilities to be able to mine the information, things that you're saying, actions that you're undertaking. And they also own the channels that provide you with the advertisement to commercialize those decisions. So you can quite easily build a complete infrastructure that customizes customizes the message to whatever it is that you're thinking about or acting about. And there is this constant pressure about whose data is it, what's privacy. Last week, with remarkably little fanfare, Google changed the default terms and conditions on their account so that they can now tie your activity, your data, much closely to the analytics and the parsing down the end. It is at the moment worth saying that they say that they are not at the moment using data in Google Mail to provide advertisement leads, but that is a caveat. It is just at the moment. But nevertheless, there is this tension about who owns the data, what is personal, what is private, who controls it, who owns it, what's the product? Is that Google Docs the product, or is your data the product? It probably isn't a great surprise to you or anyone else that given that when a message, a commercial advertising message, is very personal, you're very much likely to read to it. We also see the same kinds of things in recommendations to consume research articles. So in some work which is at yet unpublished, a colleague of mine, Kate Davis, and I did some research. We were looking at what prompts you to read an article. Not unsurprisingly, if you see a link from someone you don't really know on Twitter that says this is an article, there isn't a great strong call for action. You're not very likely to go and click on that and consume it. Whereas if you're in presence, you see a colleague of yours and that colleague gives you a copy of the article and says, read this, it is perfect for you. It is not really surprising that we see that there is a very strong call for action there and people are very likely to go and read that article and to use that article. So I think that there is some room to enlarge what we do in terms of making predictions about what people want to consume, to drive that kind of recommendation, to bring it much closer, much more personal to the person who is consuming the data. But one of the problems is that whereas if I go onto Google and I search for a Trek 3700 fluorescent green mountain bike, I'm very likely to be looking to want to make a purchase. If I go onto Scopus or Google Scholar and do a similar kind of search, I'm probably not going to want to buy something, but it's actually unclear who I am or what I'm doing. If I'm a PhD, if I'm an undergraduate, if I'm a citizen scientist, the kind of results that you want to get back are going to be quite different. And when you do group searches, when you do cohorts, we have the same problem. So if someone uses a product that enables wide-scale analysis of portfolios and collections, we have the same kind of problem. So a funding agency is going to be wanting to look for some kinds of evidence. Someone who is faculty or a research officer, they're going to be wanting for different kinds of evidence. And when it gets to thinking about what governments want or agencies want, they all have different uses, they all have different nuances. So whereas with a commercial position it's relatively straightforward to build these big chains of data, it's much harder to do that in the academic sector. That isn't to say that we're not going to see that emerging as the price of computation and as the sophistications and as the amount of data being collected increases, but at the moment we're not really in that position. Where we are going to see these two things together is where there is this intersection between big data and scholarly metrics. And in fact, the relationship between the two has always been very close. So Garfield's work on building his scholarly indexes inspired the Google founders to do their work on the PageRank algorithm. In itself, a metric, although you would never see it. You don't see a number associated with it. But nevertheless, it drives the search results. The PageRank work that they did has latterly inspired bibliometricians and scientometricians to create new kinds of metrics. So I did some work with the University of Ireland in Galway, building grey literature documents, and there we were using the PageRank algorithm to understand the relative importance of non-scholarly domains in terms of communicating scholarly ideas. Bit of a mouthful. And then there is this tension as a consequence. So we've got, on one side, we've got the historical bibliometrician, scientometric communities, and on the other hand, we've got the big data folk who are very theory-light, very interested in doing these massive computations to find trends, do experiments, and so forth. When, in my last organisation, in fact, we had a senior vice president, and that SVP used to have both the big data team, the web analytics team, and the scientometric team underneath her. So that gives you some idea of how close the relationship is between the two things. We have this complexity that legacy metrics, as I call them, the old form of bibliometrics, they tend to look very complicated. The maths is very difficult. The papers are a challenge to read. Whereas with the new modern metrics, we tend not even to see numbers involved. We just tend to see recommendations, we see ranking. They're incredibly complex, much more complicated than the citation-based metrics, but they tend to look much more simpler. So we have this tension between the two cultures of metrics development. Because on one hand, with the legacy metrics, we do benefit from having 40 years worth of history. But the downside of that is that we have 40 years of history. We have this inability perhaps to learn from the future, an inability to reflect. Very much attuned the bibliometrics and scientometric community to creating products that are for use by experts. The papers, as I say, are very difficult to read. We use lots of terms like proxies and impact, which are not necessarily what you might expect them to be. So if you talk to an expert bibliometrician and ask them for a definition of a metric, they might give you one answer. That understanding does not necessarily translate to other people who are having to use these metrics in the course of their day-to-day life. As a development community, I believe that we have a responsibility to do very much the kind of thing that Cameron was talking about, in terms of being much more open to the wider community, to support learning, to support educated use of metrics. The computations and analysis have always been the focus. The academic side of things have always been the focus for the bibliometric community. There hasn't been enough focus on talking about what metrics mean, talking about when you can use them, talking about how you can use them to support people's understanding. Because previously, there were just a handful of people who were involved in these computations, a handful of people who were using them in the day-to-day work. Nowadays, we expect people to use metrics and to be more adept at using metrics when they're filling in funding applications, when they're filling in their CVs and so forth. We expect people to know their H-index, we expect people to understand what an H-index looks like for their discipline. But we don't really support the use and the development of these metrics. So I tend to characterize this as we have this move going on that what bibliometricians and scientometricians do, they do these analysis, they do these interpretations. It's a very complicated, painstaking process. Whereas what people really want to be able to do is to measure what they're doing and to get an immediate sense of their work, their impact. They want to be able to get feedback on how they're doing in terms of communicating their results and seeing the results of their work being picked up by their colleagues and by people in a wider situation. So my final part is going to be talking about the socio-economic context of metrics and evaluations and why it's important that we address some of these issues about personal, private data and about who uses metrics and who is involved in metrics and who understands metrics. It has become increasingly clear that we live in a time of extraordinary economic pressure and political change. Even a year ago, I don't think many of us would have expected to see the rapid change that we have seen over the course of the last year. 2 weeks ago, when I started putting these slides together, people were talking about a shortfall in the economy of £55 billion. Yesterday, they were talking about a shortfall of £84 billion, so clearly things are not going in the right direction. It is going to be increasingly difficult for anybody who relies on funding. And that includes farmers, that includes academics, that includes infrastructure projects, that includes the health service. And we also have this extremely challenging political discourse. We heard earlier Cameron talking about the issues that people talk about, experts and expertise. And we also have this expectation that commercial solutions, that big data can solve a number of these problems for us. I think that we're going to see politicians coming under increasing pressure to get more results for the investment that they put into the academic sector. I think there could be a potential collision between these different things. This pressure on funding, this pressure to produce answers, this pressure to understand, to predict the impact of what's going on in the future. I mean, if we think about this, this is a government who is talking about reintroducing the 11 plus exam, wanting to see a grammar school in every town. This is a government which, if those policies are enacted, will see fewer people being qualified to go into university. We need to have fewer universities in blood, will be what the outcome of that policy is, particularly if we have a greater pressure on seeing overseas students come into this country. So they're going to need to be making very fast, very complicated decisions. And whereas they might have wanted to turn to the people in academia to produce answers to those questions, my worry is that focus on a lack of expertise, that trust in big data to produce answers, is going to see answers coming from outside that don't have the same legacy, that don't have the same history that we who are involved in the academic community have. A different set of values, perhaps. I worry that in the absence of sufficient ownership and engagement, we're going to see what I have decided to term voodoo scientometrics. Black box numbers, private data being calculated in a different way, in ways that we're not accustomed to it. An increasing disconnect between the academe and between the decision-making process. I believe that we need to engage with the metrics process. We need to engage with how we are being valued and how our outputs are being used in a way that we have not yet seen. Because this has been my fear since 2011, that I'm going to wake up and someone is going to tweet that there is a new company that have decided they can calculate the thing that matters, that there is some mysterious black box technology that enables an accurate computation of metrics work, that this is a company that can tell you whether this university should be expanding or that university should be closed. Because we do have to think about the consequences of the economic and cultural change and what that's going to do to our infrastructure. And what a government that is suddenly short of 55 billion or 84 billion is going to have to do as a consequence of that short term. And that is apparently the end of my slides. Sorry, I thought I had another one after that. Oh, I do. There we go. Right. I knew that I had another number because I always like to use this picture. We've been here before where we've had a focus on a single metric. And in fact, many people around the world still have that same focus on a single metric. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Romania at the Altmetrics conference, and I listened with some horror to colleagues from around Eastern Europe whose evaluation process is entirely dependent on the journal impact factor. It's at the heart of what they do. I thought that things had improved a bit. I am way wrong. And there's a reason for it, right? The reason is not the maths, it's not the computation. It's the fact that having a journal impact factor is a badge of cultural value for these journals. They see it as being a stepping stone to a wider audience. And we really have to remember the hidden value of metrics when it comes to that kind of involvement. So their policies entirely focused on getting articles into journals that have a journal impact factor. I really hope that we don't fall into this trap of lurching from a dependency on one number to another number. For me, that would be a great error of judgment. But we can only do that if we develop metrics out in the open, if we look to the academe and the various users within the academic community to value our metrics and to develop those metrics that they need and they use to be able to answer the questions that they need to answer. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.